Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining our podcast today. With us, we have Mike Mournighan. He is an apps engineer working with our Power over Ethernet devices. How are you doing today, Mike?
I'm doing pretty well, Isaac. How about yourself, man?
I'm pretty good. Thanks for joining me. Today, I want to kind of just get an introduction on what Power over Ethernet is. I know what Ethernet cables are. I know to some extent what power is. I'm going to make an educated guess and say Power over Ethernet is delivering power through the Ethernet cable. Did I
Yeah.
did I hit that on the head?
Yeah, nail on the head, man. So, a little bit more in depth. The Ethernet standard is a bipolar signal, so it's a differential signal. Sorry, that's coming across the PHY there. And so power over Ethernet does is takes the common mode of that differential signal and is applying a fixed DC power across the Ethernet cable so that it can deliver energy from a big network switch to a smaller device at the other end. So that's kind of the general perspective, is taking that differential signal and just riding on top of it with some DC voltage.
I see. And I guess what are the main components of is it just the cable or where does the power come from and where is it delivered?
Sure, yeah. So you've got two main ends. You can kind of think of it as the sourcing end and the sinking end,
Hmm.
and the equipment name is, relative to that. So you have the power sourcing equipment, or PSE, and that's the side that's going to be putting power out onto the Ethernet cable. And then you have the powered device, the device that's sinking power, and that's respectively called a PD. So the PSE is probably sitting in a network switch somewhere, putting that power on the Ethernet cable. When, let's say, it's talking to a camera, that camera is going to have a PD inside it, and we're going to call that camera a PD itself as well. And so power is going to flow from your switch all the way through that cable into your PD.
Okay, and just so we're clear, PD stands for powered device.
Yeah, that's right. PD is power device. Power sourcing equipment is a PSE.
Okay, great. And when we connect up these devices, is the power always running?
Yeah, that's a good question. So no, the answer is the power is not always running. The power is stimulated by the PSE, the sourcing equipment side, and what it's doing is it's constantly pulling that Ethernet interface with this thing called detection, and it's constantly going through, and it only applies a full voltage of 50 volts or higher. It only applies that voltage if it detects a powered device, a PD, at the other end. So only after the PD and the PSE go through this analog handshake is power actually applied. Otherwise, it's a very low voltage, low current situation, completely not super useful, but also not dangerous, which is the real point. So
Hmm.
power only applied after the handshake is complete.
Okay, so let's go a little bit deeper into this handshake process. I know there are several types of PoE classifications. Is that handshake process the same with all of the classes?
That's a good question. Yeah. So the standard has been evolving for quite a while, and so starting with the early standards, they look a little bit different, the handshake does, but in reality, each one is backwards compatible and just kind of building on one another. So the first step of that handshake is detection. And after you've detected, what you've said is, okay, I, the power sourcing equipment, see you, the powered device, on the other end. And then what's going to happen next is the power sourcing equipment is going to go into this stage called classification. It's going to put out a new voltage, and the PD is going to communicate through a new current how much power it's expecting to use or receive from your power sourcing equipment, from your PSE. So that step, that classification step, has grown over time. At first, it was a very simple one classification pulse, and now as the PDs have gone higher and higher to support larger products at the end of this Ethernet cable, they are going to request more power, and that is communicated through additional class pulses. And so every standard that the Power over Ethernet body has released has had more class pulses to indicate more power. That's kind of how the handshake has evolved.
I see. So after this overview, we have the PSE end of the cable and the PD end of the cable. What products does Silicon Labs have that supports both ends of the cable now?
That's great. So right now we have the SI3459, and that product is a power sourcing piece of equipment, that's going to be the one who's controlling the analog handshake and delivering and detecting whether or not there's something at the other end. Then we have the 34OX products. Those are the products that sit at the far end of the cable. Those come in different flavors for the different amount of power that your end application is going to need. So the 3404 is 15 watts and 3406 being a 30-watt device.
Yeah, so I think we understand what the switch is. That is the power sourcing equipment. But then there's a lot of other end devices that these Ethernet cables can be plugged into. Like you mentioned earlier, it would be the cameras, and I would imagine lighting as well. I think you and I were speaking about this previously. What was that phrase that you said? Connected ceiling?
Yeah,
Can you
yeah,
just
that's
tell a little
right.
bit more about that?
Sure can. So a new standard is coming out now, about to be ratified through the IEEE, and that's called the BT standard. And alongside this BT standard is this huge push for the idea of PoE lighting and the connected ceiling, the idea that Ethernet cables can drive your lighting in a building. And on top of that Ethernet backbone, maybe you have occupancy sensors or something else that can communicate over that Ethernet cable, whose new purpose now is to deliver power to your light instead of AC voltages. That has a lot of advantages in a context of wiring of a building becomes much simpler and less hazardous in a big way. So there's a huge amount of advantages for PoE lighting, but that's just one target market.
Hmm.
You also have pan tilt zoom cameras and security cameras that they can perform more and more actions. There's actually some cameras out in the market powered over PoE that have defoggers and windshield wipers on the camera to make sure that they have constant visibility. So security is another big sector. And I think that, a third sector that I would talk about is the wireless access points. So that piece of equipment already needs to be connected to the network in a high bandwidth way, but it probably doesn't need that much power. So if it's a 30 watt or 60 watt, or at this point going all the way up to a 70 watt, we can deliver power and network connectivity to that wireless access point over the same cable. And that really cuts down on complexity in an industrial environment as well as in an office environment.
Those all sound like great applications. And Mike, I think that's all the time I have today, but I want to thank you again for sitting down and recording another podcast with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Isaac.
You have a good one.